When we go to analyze our audience, there's going to be two major categories of identifiers that we look at. The first of these being demographic identifiers, and the second of these being psychographic identifiers. We'll go through each of these. But when we think of demographics, we tend to think of things like age, race, and gender. And as you can see here, I have a chart that breaks down the population of California based on the 2010 census by race. So for example, you can see that we have about 40% white Anglo, 37% Hispanic Latino, 12% Asian, etc. And so we need to take these sorts of demographics into account when we're looking at our audience, because these demographics are going to change the way that our audience sees the world. So the first of these demographics is age. And really, when you think about it, our age determines what we have and have not lived through, and therefore determines our experiences and determines the way that we tend to see the world. So, for example, people who grew up in the post 9/11 era lived a very different life to those who grew up in the pre 9/11 era. I remember that when I was a kid and my grandmother would fly in from Southern California, my brother and I would be able to run right up to the arrivals gate and greet her right when she came off the plane. And when we were waiting for her to come off the plane, we would be able to watch all of the planes on the runways taking off and landing. And then 9/11 happened and we would have to wait in the terminal. We would have to wait outside or at the curb even in order to meet her. And we could no longer go through the security line because we needed a boarding pass. And so people who lived in that pre 9/11 era remember a state that was much less secure. There was less security, right? Like we didn't need to go through as intense of a security check to get on an airplane, and we didn't need to go through a metal detector to go to a baseball game or a movie. Whereas people who grew up in the post 9/11 era see these security checkpoints as very much normal because that's just what they've always known. And so our age changes our frame of reference because it changes the experiences that we've lived through. And if you don't look to the age of your audience, you might have a misstep and you might have misunderstandings between you and your audience because you might have had very different experiences. Gender is another big demographic that we need to tend to look at. And that's because our gender very much can define our human experience. And I'm talking about more than just men and women here, right? Gender exists on this wider spectrum. And there are lots of different experiences that could be had right in your classroom. But as an example of men's experience versus women's experience, if you ask a woman whether or not she usually texts her friends that she got home safe after having met up with them, she will tell you that she probably does this. However, if you ask a man this same question, he either does it on occasion or never even really thought about doing something like that. Because the reality of the situation is that men and women walk in a very different world. Statistics show that women are much more likely to be sexually assaulted and raped than men are. And yes, men do get sexually assaulted and raped, but women do so on a much greater scale. And so because of that, we experience a very different world. And folks who identify as neither a man or a woman also experience a very different world from those who exist on that quote unquote binary. And so we have to take into account the genders that exist in our classroom so that we can compensate for that and understand the experiences that our classmates may or may not have had. In addition to these, culture also plays a really big role in the experiences that we have. Now, in an ideal world, America is supposed to be this melting pot of culture. And we're supposed to all kind of get along and assimilate, but that's not the world that we live in. It's a really unfortunate fact that our race very much determines the experience that we have in this world. Someone who is white experiences a much different world to someone who is Hispanic or someone who is Black or someone who is Asian. And so it very much defines our experience. So if you're doing a topic like immigration reform or like the Black Lives Matter movement or something along those lines, if you are standing in front of a mostly white audience, they are going to view your speech in a very different way to an audience that is full of people of color. So we have to keep in mind the culture of our audience and the diversity of our audience in order to determine what topics we talk about and how we talk about those topics. So these are kind of the big three, right? Because we can see these three very easily. We can look at someone and with some ease determine their age, their gender, and their culture. But some of the demographics that we don't tend to think about right away include things like religion, because there is a wide variety of religions that could be sitting in the classroom as well. Within Christianity alone, there's half a dozen other categories, like Catholic, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Baptist, right, Protestant. There's so many just within Christianity. But outside of that, right, we have Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, and so many others. And again, our religion and our religious beliefs very much define our experiences, right? They change the way that we see the world. So we have to be aware of what religions do and don't exist, right? Because you could also have agnostics and atheists sitting in the room, and take into account the fact that that's going to change their values. And you have to understand what your audience's values are so that you don't cause offense to anyone. In addition, if you know the various different groups that your audience might belong to, that can tell you a lot about the group that you are standing in front of. So, for example, if you know that you have a bunch of poli-sci majors, or you know that there are a lot of nursing majors in the room, that tells you a lot about their goals in life, and that tells you about different things that they might value. Right? So understanding different groups that your audience might be a part of can tell you a lot about them. In addition, if you're on like a larger campus that has fraternities and sororities, that can also send a message. The club memberships that your audience might have send a message. And so we can look to all of these different group memberships and try to understand the various different experiences and values that our audience might have. In addition to all of this, we can look to the education of our group as well as to the potential occupations of our audience to really understand who they are. Because we all have different paths in life. In fact, the people sitting in this room might be taking this class for a number of different reasons. They might be taking it because it's required for an AA to transfer. They might be taking it because they have to take it for their bachelor's degree. They might be taking it because they never took it when they were originally in school. They might be taking it just to improve their own skills, right? For like self-improvement. And so we can't even assume that everyone in the room has the same educational goals as us. And so we have to take into account how that's going to change the way that we do our speeches. And finally, the occupations of our classmates, of our audience, is going to change the way that we talk about different topics. And like if we have skilled workers to stay-at-home moms, whatever it is, that's going to change the way that we view the world. So we have to take into account all of these various different demographics in order to understand who our audience is and how they might interact with our topics. Now, let's talk about psychographic analysis. This involves what the audience is thinking about. And so we have to take into account the pre-existing notions that your audience might have about your topic, as well as the pre-existing notions that your audience might have about you. So oftentimes we come to understand a lot of various different topics in the world, but we don't truly understand them. And so you have to take into account the fact that your audience might already have some knowledge about your topic, but that it's your job to make sure that they have the correct knowledge about your topic. So you have to ask yourself, how much does your audience already know? And is their knowledge oversimplified or prejudiced in some way? And finally, you have to take into account the pre-existing notions that your audience might have about you. It's just a fact of life that we look at someone and make a snap decision about what they are or who they are, right? We look at someone and we determine their age and their gender and their race, and we make judgments based on that. So you have to take into account the judgments that your audience might make about you and how you can combat those pre-existing notions. For example, I am a short white woman who looks fairly young, and so I get a lot of pre-existing notions about me and about my qualifications as a teacher. And so I have to combat that through the way that I act in front of my class and through the way that I convey my information and even through the clothes that I wear to class. And so I know what the pre-existing notions are in my audience's head about me, and I have figured out ways to try and combat that. You have to do the same thing when it comes to your audience. It's not a nice thing that we make these assumptions about other people, but it is a fact, and so we have to deal with that as speakers. So that's a lot of information that you can take in about your audience and that you have to consider when you are thinking about your speech topics. So next, let's talk about actually conducting this audience analysis.